Right, thank you everyone, welcome back. This really, you mentioned you thought you had the graveyard shift earlier on. This really is it. Yeah. So thank you all for staying with us. Appreciate this is the last session of the day. It should be really interesting though, and we walked through today quite a lot of strategic reflections, some big think ideas on net zero, alongside some active production methods of how we capture energy, how we produce it. So what we're going to hear from in just a second is Eric Roberts from IES, who's going to outline for us a presentation around one of their big think ideas, which is around the concept of digital twinning. I'll let him talk a little bit about that in just a second, and then what we'll do is we'll kind of try and break that concept down a little bit for everyone, and through the panel we'll sort of challenge that, and we'll sort of see how that's reflective within the industries that we represent and how we as an industry sector can engage with the model that Eric's going to present to us, but also then an opportunity to throw it open to the floor as well. And we'll have an opportunity for you guys to ask some questions. If it looks like everyone's just agreeing and going, yeah, Eric, this is great, then by all means throw in some really difficult questions, because I think we've been very gentle on our speakers today, so it's probably high time when everyone's a bit tired and wants to get on the road that we make it just a little bit tricky for everyone this afternoon. So with that in mind, and Eric, the floor is yours. Jackie, that's the signal.
I think that was the signal.
You missed the signal, you're eating. You're just, some professionals.
Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry, we have something completely different. So decarbonisation road mapping. So we've heard a lot about people road mapping today, how they get to net zero. And this is just a way from IES how to do that. So just a little bit of background on myself and IES. I've been a mechanical engineer 37 years now in industry, the last 27 years specifically in building energy modelling, both with my own consultancies within make as well as promotion consultancy, as well as in software development and academia. Lecturer, do part-time lecturing at Loughborough. I'm the MSc there, a couple of PhDs also there who are looking again into digital twin and operational energy. And I was one of the principal authors on the LETI Climate Emergency Design Guide. Specifically, I wrote chapter 4 in that, which was the energy storage side of it. In terms of IES are a software company based in Glasgow, worldwide company now. We've been developing software solutions for basically building energy, basically building decarbonisation since day one. So we're in building simulation, from looking at a single building up to our latest stuff where we're able to look at multiple buildings at the same time now. So net zero, how do we get there? We've talked about this a lot today. I'm not going to dwell too long on this, but to actually understand how we go about producing a net zero roadmap, we've got to have a start point, we've got to create a baseline, and that baseline comes from the data that we've got within the built environment. So everyone says how much data we've got. Oh, I've got loads of data, we've got a DMS, we've got all this. That's great. Most of the time, we've got all this data. We are quite data rich in that. No one ever does anything with it. No one ever looks at it. No one goes and does that because there's a massive skills gap in understanding how you use that data. So all these buildings that we're benchmarking, we're looking at, they're probably not even running at their most optimum to start with, as we heard about earlier. Maintenance has been shelved because that costs money. We don't want to do that, but it actually costs you money not to do that maintenance, ironically. So we need to create a baseline. So we need to understand really what our start point is. Then we can move through a whole host of different pieces of work, whether we're going through that, looking at the data we've got, looking at the BMS data, finding out why our buildings aren't performing as well as they should be, optimising them, and coming up with an actual real baseline of where our building is. Then we can start to look at how we can improve that building through very shallow retrofit, deep retrofit over time, local energy networks, and as we said earlier, is ending up with renewable generation as the final port of call in what we're doing. So how can we do that? What can we do? We can use this concept called digital twinning. Now, digital twin, it's a bit of a buzzword in industry now. Everyone seems to be using it, all in different contexts. An actual digital twin requires two things, and that is a physics-based simulation model, and it requires live data to calibrate that model. So these are effectively, digital twin is just another word for calibrated models. So they are models that are calibrated to real life. These have been used within the AEC industry. We're like one rung above agriculture in our adoption of new technology. We are right at the bottom. We might think we're really advanced, but we're not in comparison to finance and people like that who've been using this a lot. Digital twins have been used for 30, 35 years, automotive, used all the time. Aerospace, have been using it since the mid-80s. Formula One, probably the most direct exponent of it. They use it on all of their cars, all of that together, that telemetry together, that data, understand how their product is performing in real time, in real life, to optimize it as they're going along. And they do this through having dynamic models of those products and real-time telemetry data from them. From that data, once you've got that, you can then start to produce learning AI on it to actually understand, test what-if scenarios, fill in the gaps in data. We always end up with data gaps, so you need the ability to fill that in, take out anomalies within there, take out outliers in your data, and fill that in and make sure that data stream you've got coming in is actually meaningful and can be useful. So bring that in, that creates this thing called a digital twin. As I said, it's just a calibrated model, it's another term for a calibrated model. From that calibrated model, we can then start to test what-if scenarios. So it allows you to test with great accuracy. And we can get within calibrated models, you can get within 2-3% of real life. You can never get quite there, because there's all sorts of things within the built environment that we haven't got control over. We don't quite know how well that insulation, the continuity of that insulation, we don't know exactly what that thermal bridge is. There's a number of unknowns in there. The biggest unknown we have is weather and weather data. So that is the biggest driver of what consumes energy in your building. So having access to a local weather station is really useful. That then allows you to carry out a number of different services surrounding that digital twin, from improving operational energy to SG reporting and so on and so forth. And also allows you to then look at investment into all of this stuff, with payback periods, operational, the big one at the moment, reducing operational energy costs within there, and the costs you can save, identifying cost savings can actually then start to be used to refund some of the work we're actually doing. Now we can do this at a number of different levels. Now we can do this at a single building level. Just in the IES and building simulation, we concentrated in our construction industry on one building at a time and doing that in detail. But now we've got technology where we can actually expand that, so we can look at multiple buildings, so we can start to look at a portfolio or a campus level. As IES, we're just doing this for a number of universities. We've got a big project on at Glasgow University for the whole campus, and ironically, DMU this morning said they wanted to be the leader in the East Midlands in decarbonisation, but considering we're just building a full campus-wide digital twin for Nottingham University and for Nottingham Trent, they're probably in third place at the minute. And we can scale that up to a city level as well. So biggest model we've got at the moment is 90,000 buildings. That's 90,000 buildings in a single model full, and that is the whole of the city of Warrington. And I'm just going to expand that just through another project we're doing for the city of Limerick and their climate action plan for all there. And this is concentrated just on the public sector buildings for the council. And looking at their plan for 2030. So this is like again what we're talking about this morning. We're saying, oh, I want to be net zero by 2030. And other councils going, oh, I want to be net zero by 2028 because their mate in the next council along said they wanted to be 2030, so they just wanted to be better. And what's the realism of actually achieving that? How do we do that? How do we develop a roadmap of doing that? So what we've done is start to create a digital twin of the areas within Limerick. So it's actually, we have a model of the entire city with all of the buildings within that city. This is just picking out the council buildings within there and looking and starting to identify what buildings we're going to target in what time period. So this is running through from 2025 to 2050 of what buildings we're going to do. Whilst we're doing this, we're running multi-year simulations of these buildings, looking at different retrofit activities that are going on there with these buildings. But in conjunction with this, because we can model traffic within here, we can look at cars, etc. We're modelling the traffic flow within there and the decarbonisation of the urban transport within that. So this is just set slides just running through the buildings that are being done at that time, identifying which were the primary ones that they wanted to do by 2025, 2030, 2035, 40, 45, and then you've got these buildings that are 2050, which arguably at 30 years time we may never get to those buildings. They might even be part of the council's portfolio at that time, but they've still got to run those buildings during that time. So during that period, going right back when I talked about we can gather that data, you can still go in there and optimise those buildings and save energy, save money, save carbon doing that, even though they may never form part of your final portfolio. But it's like painting the fourth bridge. You get to the end, you've got to start again. So once we've run through all of that, we're looking at multi-years. And then we're glad to know this is the last slide of the day. We can start to then look at what we can do across a period of time. So we're looking, as I said, we're running all these buildings over multi-years. So we're using, if you're familiar with simulation, we use weather data, full 365 days, 8,760 hour weather files. There's a number of these weather files that are future weather predictions as well. And we can use those future weather years to actually look at what's happening in there, as well as prediction, bringing in predictions of grid decarbonisation, so the fuel factors for the likes of electricity, gas, or everything can be factored in there, and we can start to identify what we're doing, where it's going to be, and start to quantify what are the savings from each of the interventions that we're going to do. You'll notice right at the far end, probably the most important one is this period between 2022 where we are now in 2025, well, there's not a lot happening there. That's because we've got to go through this whole painful process of gathering data. Now, with a lot of these buildings, there's no record drawings, there's no survey information, there's no mechanical input, there's no nothing. We've actually got to go in and acquire that data. It's a very important thing. We'll think they've got this information, we actually haven't got to spend a period of time doing this. That's actually quite a considerable period of time in this roadmap of everyone wanting to get to net zero by a certain time. But we haven't got that, and then it's just a matter of running through all of these. And you can use this. Obviously, this can be updated as you go along. You can change tact on any of these buildings. You can rerun those models. This whole roadmap becomes a dynamic tracker of what you're actually doing, what you're proposing against what is actually happening. So that's all I wanted to do. That was just recap. That's just using this digital twin technology to allow us to build up these roadmaps with a degree of a very high level of accuracy for these predictions, which obviously helps if you're going to finance or anything. Financial institutions love that accuracy to lend you money to do this stuff. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric. If I can invite the other panelists back up. I just wonder whether we can have that Limerick slide. Sorry, Jackie, I know you just closed it because I suspect it's probably quite interesting to a number of people who are going to look at that and say, how do we do this? And I guess, Eric, if I can just pick up on a couple of points you just made. One of which was that you were saying about a skills gap in understanding the data, and I'm just wondering whether actually there is a skills gap in understanding the data, or whether it's just, as you touched on at the end, just a gap in data.
There's a bit of both. There's a big gap in data. So we've got a number of projects, off the top of my head, we went into a large museum in Scotland, it's a Riverfront Museum, if you know, in Scotland, award-winning, Sterling-winning, prize-winning building, absolutely beautiful building, but they felt it was really expensive to run. So we got involved with that. We went in there, and the first thing you go and do is, well, what's your data? Oh, you've got this great new BMS and everything in there. We've got no data. All we've got are how much gas you're using, how much electric you're using. That's it. But that's what most people use to benchmark their actual buildings against them. They haven't gone down to that granular level. When we tried to go down to that next level, we found all the sub-meters, but to save a few quid during the construction, the contractor didn't actually wire any of them in. So we couldn't get any data to actually do it. So they had to, then there was obviously a big contract dispute about that. That took about 9 months to actually resolve that. And then when we went in there, we got that data, we found other things. But then we also found that to say putting another substations in, the contractor required the building next door into it, so they were actually paying for the exhibit next. There was a separate exhibit, so they'd never paid any electric because the museum was paying for it. So it was just things like they didn't know because no one knew, because no one had actually looked at the data. No one knew what the data meant anyway, but they hadn't got any data because all they got was a gas and electric bill.
And I think that for anyone involved in any sort of local authority asset management, I think that probably chimes quite strongly with some of us who have experienced that before with a number of assets that we manage. I wonder on your Limerick model though, whether, because I guess if you've gone in and sold this as a sort of solution, and it's a great sort of visual, you know, I think we all kind of looked at the visuals and thought, yeah, that's really cool, and it probably mainly links with your great Lego model analogy that you mentioned earlier on. But what have you got in terms of back from Limerick that their revenue investment is going to continue to grow to be able to capture that data so you can do what you do, otherwise they've kind of bought into this solution, and unless they go out and spend money and invest money in not just the data, not just gathering the data, but some infrastructure to store that data in that they can use dynamically and continue to ring fence and increase their revenue costs on maintenance over the next 5-10 years. What assurance have you got from them that they will continue to invest so you can deliver the outcome?
Well, obviously that's a bit of trust on that one, rather than actually doing and carrying through for it. One of the things we've identified, obviously gathering that data, is having that data to start with and understanding how, whether your buildings are running efficiently or inefficiently, you can actually go and act upon it, so they can then start going in and carrying out that maintenance on that building, so then they can start to save money. So the money that they're saving, because we've got all this linked to dashboards, so we've got live dashboards, we can identify what savings are being made during that period. They're ring fencing that money that they're saving on the operation of buildings to actually finance then parts of the improvements that they need to do within these buildings. So the savings they're making are actually identifiable, and then are able to put back into what they're actually going to do.
And have you given, I was just thinking that John, you touched earlier on in your presentation about some of the difficulties in planning and working with a specific supply chain that could get your glass manufactured to your spec and working to your precise specs. Have you given any thought to how you manage the supply chain on this? So when you're doing that modelling, Eric, that those contractors, the decision makers involved in the model are all feeding into the same thing. Otherwise, it's great as just an analytical diagnostic. Yeah. But I guess I'm coming at it from how do I transfer this into my reality?
Yeah, I think it's good about it. What was picked up on earlier, was actually having all these parties that are involved within that design team actually have, being coordinated and having that, we see a lot within construction. You can have a design, a concept of it that's carried through. So you'll have a concept architect, and you'll have an M&E and engineers. They're only there just to take it to planning, and then it's taken away, and they got rid of, and another team comes in to actually do the delivery. So they don't transfer any information over because no one's going to take that PI risk of doing that. So they've got to do their due diligence. Their due diligence is to redo the design. So redo the design, they're trying to then deliver it for X amount of money and make a profit on it. So you get that disconnect. We actually gone back to a time where we actually had continuity all the way through the 7 stages and that responsibility through into operation. Then we can actually start to deliver it. The more disconnects we have along that process, the more problems we're going to have in actually achieving it, any of this stuff, because it's always then because somebody else's responsibility, like nothing to do with me, etc. If they set the scene, I just couldn't deliver that. So that's what's going to solve that, a lot of that problem.
Rainey, how do you see this kind of interacting with the sort of models that you were presenting?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking about it, and I'm just on the BRE project, and I've always said, wouldn't it be great if we could put sort of inherent sort of data points inside the house now, you know, at a point of construction, and then move on. But I think part of the challenge, by having these disconnects between different design consultants from one side to another. The challenge I see and we have is this commercial viability of it. So there's no incentivization really to kind of go through from the moment to take it from end to end, because where does the risk lie? And you touched upon it, and I think part of that is going back to how we operate as a main contractor, but also how we operate with our client. How I find at the moment that there's firewalls, but maybe because of conflict of interest, it's difficult to influence upstream in terms of some of the briefings that are done and inform some of what delivery does to that side, because then you then shut out to deliver, even on the frameworks. I'm not talking about the framework, but I find that that's the challenge we find at the moment, how it almost goes back to what the client is asking for and part of why they need it, and then that inherits into what the delivery aspect needs to be, and there's justification for why we do what we need to do.
But that's really important, because that's why sustainability needs to be addressed from day zero in project definition. And so often sustainability comes in stage 2 when we're starting to look at solutions rather than objectives. And as you say, that learning has to come full circle from the POE of real data on achieved buildings and be fed into the cycle of the briefing and targets and aspirations for the next buildings. And that so rarely happens, even in large joined up estates. It so rarely happens that meaningful information from POE gets fed into the front end of the next one.
The cynic in me might argue, forgive me Eric, because I'm just going to play devil's advocate for a second. The cynic in me might argue that this is just a nice visualization of actually what BIM should be telling us as an architect. John, what do you think?
No, I think it's doing far more than that, because I think it's looking at projections. So I think potentially BIM could look at that with projections. But my question mark is about how you review those assumptions at these different steps, because as you said, it's dynamic, isn't it? So if you don't introduce something on that line, and obviously what's not on there is the cost of energy, which if you put that on the graph,
you could overlay.
You certainly couldn't predict that for next week, let alone next 30 years. So yeah, it's dynamic.
Yeah, so a lot of that depends on what you're trying to optimise around, what points you're looking at. And we're looking at carbon. If you overlay energy on that, or if you overlaid embodied energy on it, on these things, you'd start to deliver something completely different of what metrics you're trying to optimise, trying to improve your design against.
And the key, what I might say, polar bear in the room is we're not looking at retrofit with existing buildings. Generally, and most of the discussion today has been on new build, and yeah, that's the far harder challenge. And 80% of the building stock that's going to be around in 2050 has already been built.
Yeah, I think you see it on the graph there, where we're projecting, aiming to move net zero. We've got by 2050 there, we've got all the grid being decarbonised and everything, and we're still not at net zero.
No.
We still can't get there, because you've got some buildings that you can never get that far. So you're going to have some buildings, historical buildings, that are going to be consumed or producing carbon, but you're then going to have newer buildings that are offsetting that. They're actually going to have to be processed, they're actually going to have to produce, they're going to have to become energy centres to offset the worst performing buildings.
So with that in mind, and I suppose there's sort of a step back, but from an asset management perspective, I'll ask you this question really because someone who's got some experience across this field, but do you not need to do your asset rationalisation plan right at the get-go then, so you know what you need to dispose of here and now? So you need to do your forward projections now on how your authority is going to utilise all the assets now. So you need to do that big think piece for the next 15-20 years right now, so you can dispose of what you don't need, because a big chunk of your carbon is based around inefficient building, particularly from a property perspective, based around our old town halls and our village pavilions and our libraries and things like that are just monster buildings that are full of asbestos.
It's interesting, isn't it? And I think it could definitely be better. If I knew then, when I managed services like this, what I know now, especially how technology has developed, I think I would have done the modelling first. And I think there is an ethical point there, because really we would be moving the problem along to someone else to sort out. Now trying to persuade politicians that this is the right thing to do, it's a different story. But I think I would try to have that information first, so that it goes into the whole complement of information that you would get through your asset management planning, which is your NIAs and your rental projections and your energy consumption and where does that building sit within the local plan? Is there a plan brief for it? How does it? Is there an interest in the marketplace? But there is. I remember I used to have this big spreadsheet with all those factors plugged in to show me which buildings I should dispose of and which buildings to develop. If I had that kind of information, I think that would have allowed me at the time to make more intelligent decisions and more long-term strategic decisions about the disposal of those assets. The reality is, in a local authority setting, it's not the same for the private sector. Quite a lot of these decisions are made for you as well. Members know which building they want to let go of, and you just follow the process around. It is about having information then to be able to present a valid and credible counter-argument to that kind of political thinking. So what I was going to ask you, is this software that IES have developed and used? Okay.
Yeah, well, yeah, we develop commercial software, so most of the consultants use our built environment software to do the analysis of buildings for design and everything, so it's pretty much ubiquitous within that. And then we've just developed in the last few years these additional tools to expand that, to recognising that people need to look at it a bit more than one building at a time, which is going to be slow.
It's very interesting. You know what, Alex, you do have a point, because an interesting, theoretically, an interesting exercise would be to actually do both and then see where the land lies. If you didn't have that information, what kind of decision you would make, and then if you plug that information in, what does that tell you about the estate, and then how do you move development forward?
Yeah, and you touched upon some of the operating realities of doing that piece anyway, which is the political environment, to say members may well want to retain those community buildings because they play a vital role in the community, even though they're costing the council a fortune and the council can't afford to run and maintain those buildings. So they're in this sort of vicious circle. I was just going to ask Tom, so seamlessly weave my way around the panel, if I may, just in terms of the, if you like, the emerging technologies aspect of this. So you were talking about your sort of diagnostics for looking at moisture integrity earlier on, and actually you sort of think about the technologies that you guys are developing and delivering at the moment compared to, so Eric Software will do their analysis based perhaps on what your projections now, but actually then your projections in 3 or 5 years time might be completely different because of the emerging technologies that are coming forward. So how do you think that those will play off each other?
So if I had my solar PV hat on, there's
You can wear whatever hat.
The solar industry moves so fast, and batteries are changing so quickly that what you're plugging into your data sets now will be totally different in 5 years' time. If you look at roofing, I mean, nothing's changed in flat roofs in 25 years, and one of the big things we have a problem with at the moment is decarbonisation of products. What will they, in a net zero world, what products can we deliver that are low embodied carbon and circular economy and that kind of thing? And so you've got very different things moving in different directions. One of my sort of questions would be, how much experience do you have of, you introduce these measures, do they deliver what your model says, and how much data do you have around that side of it? Because what we see, and it's a cultural thing going back to what's been discussed, is in the UK we have a culture where it's try and get it as cheap as you possibly can, and so you don't deliver what you originally planned because you have your budget. If you go to Germany, we're owned by a German company, they think we're absolutely insane because they will start with their brief and that's what they deliver. And I just wonder how that cultural thing is. We need to change the culture if we're going to make these things work, because otherwise we won't deliver what's in your...
We've done big university projects. The first one we did was Nanyang NTU and Nanyang Technical University in Singapore, which was they've got 250 buildings, and they obviously want to decarbonise that. So we picked a tranche of that to start with. You can't do that many buildings at the same time. So again, using this concept of looking at the energy for the whole site, what they could save there, then ring fence to actually fund what they were doing, and predicting how much energy what we were looking at, and the buildings, been retrofitting those, and we've delivered. That's a completely project, the first one. It's been delivered about 5 million Singapore dollars a year of savings over that, so it's considerable.
And how far that 5 million savings, is that pretty accurate on what you project?
Slightly over what we produce, but that's due to energy costs and stuff like that, so it's got that in there. So you can do it, you can deliver it.
Can I also ask about building resilience? So if we're in a warming world, does that your models, like, can it take into account if the weather is changing?
Yeah, well, that's what we're doing all the way through, is we're using the different weather files when we talked about. So if you looked at building regs for the UK, which changed last week, so we have to use these 60 weather years. So if we're doing overheating, which is now, if we're residential, is in the part O building for overheating, you have to use these 2020s weather years for Simpson. But there's future predictions on top of that as well for the design summer years for overheating and the test reference years, which are for energy. So we have multiple ones of those looking at the future predictions going forward, and we can just plug those straight into the software, and we can run each year to look at what that is actually looking like in 2030, 2035, 2040, whatever that weather file we've got actually is.
And I guess as you said earlier on, because you can look at this from an individual building perspective and then scale that up across a geographical area, you can then take into account a modular set of assets, and you can balance that off with some passive house built assets, etc. So you can still get that high level.
Yeah, you can go from the microscopic to the macroscopic within this whole thing. So it's scale concept.
And just to come back to a point in your presentation, Maureen, you talked about the skills aspect of it, and your ENF were economics and finance. So I guess this plays straight into the middle of those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, carbon accounting is so important, but and what you were talking about. Currently, actually, we were talking over lunch about how we see, in practical terms, how we see some of our local authorities, clients we work with, that they have actually now put 15% markup on all their prices. So having information and financial modeling that goes with that, and having those skills to be able to do it, because the other thing to consider is distribution of skills. So your company has quite a lot of knowledge with regard to, and some of the consultants here have quite a lot of specialist knowledge in specific areas. The client, I've been a client in a previous life, and when they commission work, they do not always know what they want because they do not have an insight into what your software is capable of. Yeah, if I was not here today, I would have known that this kind of thing existed. So also because they do not share resources in terms of capability, and we have spaces and we have other networks, but the reality is that intelligence is contained within a local authority setting. Coming together, I think, to procure innovation is one of the things that we need to look forward in the future, to exchange ideas and actually go down the route where two authorities together. I work one of our clients in North East London. If we had, for example, Waltham Forest, Harringay and Hackney coming together as a wider locality, because the boundaries are notional. The communities do not think, oh, now I'm crossing to go to Harringay or I'm in Waltham Forest. They experience that together. So joining funds, I think, perhaps is something that can help local authorities be able to commission work to get a better understanding of their assets, but also the impact they have in communities and more widely.
Particularly communities that are juxtaposed next to each other. I totally agree with that, because then you get a much more
and
holistic
especially in London,
representation.
Alex, where you have some. I remember when I worked in Harringay, I had Tottenham. I don't know if anyone knows London, but we had Tottenham and Highgate in the same borough, which means we have the people that are the highest earners in London society with people with the biggest issues, and they just live one bus ride away. And actually, it goes to the point I made earlier about the tension that exists between the ethical in terms of humanity and the ethical in terms of the planet. And sometimes there is that tension there.
And Eric, just sort of one final thing before I sort of open it up to the floor, if I may. I guess one of the great things about your system and the representation that you've given us is that it's very data rich, and you can make some amazing decisions based on the outputs of the data that you put in. One of the risks is that it's very data rich, and you can make some decisions based on the output. So you run into conflict because from a carbon perspective, it can show that you're on the right track. From a biodiversity gain perspective, it can show that you're spending too much effort going in one direction and not in the other. So somewhere there's a sweet spot, and I guess you need to. I suppose it comes back to that. Comes back to the point that we've sort of been saying all the way through today. So it sort of need to be segmented its way through, which is that big think piece around what our broader objectives are. So what is it that's important to our communities, our society, as our citizens of whatever, whether we're in a borough or in London or wherever we are, played off against what these things are telling us, because we're gonna put some concentrated effort in one place to decline it. But as mentioned earlier, you press one bit on the toy and something shoots out the other side of it. So it's trying to find that, and I wonder whether you've got experience of that within your software and how you've managed that.
As building designers, just compromise at the end of the day. Because if you design something specifically for ultra low energy, it's probably, you might achieve it, but it's probably a horrible place to live.
Well, I don't know. John might argue. John's beach house might tell you something different.
Remember, you've got that. There are compromises to be made between all. It's not a straightforward thing.
I think an important part also is understanding the performance gap of different systems. look at that again, what is designed and what is realised, because this is obviously a bigger picture about strategy, but we can have targets, but so few buildings meet their design targets.
I think it depends, you give a building to an engineer to design, you'll get a box with no windows in or anything like that, but it's got no soul, it's going to, that's where you need the architect to get that side into it.
At that point, Eric, I'm going to open up the floor to all the engineers who might like to throw stuff at you. There's pens and there's stuff downstairs that you can chuck this direction. Mark.
What are some of the techniques to quantify the savings or the carbon reductions that could be made, and how are they refined to keep the model as kind of dynamic as possible?
So obviously, when you run a model, you get a set of results out of it. So you're running them for, they are referred to as energy models. So to get carbon out of it, that's just multiplying because you're using carbon factor.
No, but in terms of the, like if I was going to install solar, for example,
yeah.
I don't know now on one building I've kind of got a banding of what the energy reductions I can see, but then that might change depending on the building type. And is there a process of interventions performed and then kind of the results are measured and fed back into the model? Or?
Well, obviously you can run numbers of different iterations of that model, different PV, so you've got a fixed building, different PV array sizes, different types of PV, different orientations, different configurations of it, and you can have all those results together and look at what's going on there. So you can go through that, and you can go through that optimization of parametric analysis to actually do that. So you can just run multiple different versions of the same building with different technologies associated with it.
So do one building, this state, see how it performs, and then kind of feed it back in to the overall model and see how you get on.
Yeah. Yeah.
According to Paul, you had me at parametric analysis. I lost it at that point. Declan, you can ask a question.
I think my question is quite similar actually. I think it's about the sort of end user in operation. There's variables in that. How do we identify them in the model? Obviously, there's an FM team, and there's a level, and within level 3, obviously the detailed analysis of those changes. Obviously you can do it in terms of three-dimensional model and types of products and build and everything else, but in terms of operation with the staff and the people within the building, that changes, and that change of use happens.
Yeah, I think that's where you pick that, because if you're doing the digital Twitter properly, you're collecting live data, so you'll be pushing live data into your model. That's the optimum of doing that is in real time. Most of the time it's very difficult to do that, so push it in at a delay when you're doing that. We've had this with dealing with FM teams, because you give them, they're not really there, they don't want to be running models, so your teams that run those models. And we convey them all the information through to the FM teams via dashboards. So the ones we've done, we've built them specific dashboards that they can just look at, that give them the metrics they want to look at, whether that's CO2, whether it's cost, whether it's carbon, energy, primary energy, whatever metric they want. They can bring that up on screen straight away to actually, how's it performing? How's my asset performing? What should it be performing? What's my predicted from my model I'm dealing with, and where am I? So you can quickly look side by side, and it's just distilled down to those very simple metrics that show have I got a problem, haven't I got a problem.
Thanks, Eric. Gentleman at the front.
Thanks. Hi, my name's Dwayne. I've got two questions for Paul actually. Is it Paul? IES? Sorry, Eric. I don't know where I got Paul from. The first question I've got is on the modelling itself. Because you mentioned that there was a council which was it 9,000 buildings.
90,000.
Sorry.
90,000.
90,000 buildings. And for me, who doesn't use IES a lot, well, certainly haven't used it for this purpose. It seems like modelling for that many buildings would take almost as long as the decarbonisation plan will need to run through. And what level of information do you need to actually plug into the model if you're doing it for an estate with that much buildings?
This is linked into, so we've got, if you used IES, you probably use version 5, so we've got another other tools that sit alongside that. And it's all linked into OpenStreetMap. So a lot of that data is already in OpenStreetMap. So you can go in and you just put a pin in it, drag out, I want to model this, pull that data, whatever data is in there of building location, co-locations, streets, heights and everything that's in there, you can go in and it will pull those buildings and the heights, everything within there. And we're modelling at quite a high level at that point, and then you can go down to much lower levels. So that's very dependent on where you are in the country. In the centre of London, it's incredibly detailed and put the buildings really in context.
So that gives you sort of number of floors, got sort of glazing,
yeah,
all that information.
Yeah, it depends what's in OpenStreetMap.
Right. Okay.
Give you that level. So it's a lot. I mean, it's in your presentation earlier, about overshading with the PV and everything like that. So you can do that within the model and put your model in. OpenStreetMap will give you everything that surrounds it. So very quickly you can put a PV array on there, and you can, instead of going, I think it's 20% shaded, it will give you actually how much shading is on that PV. It will give you the yield from that PV, and then you can reduce.
Is that an additional plugin from IES, or is that just part of the standard package? Yeah, but yeah, I wasn't aware of that. Sorry, the second question for you was also about the future weather predictions as well. So I wasn't aware that you could actually, there was something that's noted what the future weather predictions will be, let's say for the next 30 years. I just know that currently when we're looking at future weather predictions, we look at the two different scenarios, the +4 and +2 degrees. So is there, in what documents do you refer to for the future weather?
So there's just different places. So obviously you've got citizen weather files, which are like the official weather files if you're looking at building regulations.
For now and in the past, yeah. But it doesn't state for future.
No, so there are a number of people who have carried out, put together weather files looking at future weather effectively. So there are different things out there like Prometheus, etc.
Prometheus, sorry.
So,
yes, gentlemen.
Yeah, I think it was John who mentioned polar bears and the existing estate. I'd just like to put those together. I think one of the big polar bears, or a bigger polar bear in the room, is climate adaptation. And looking at the Limerick Decarbonization map, I think that's, it's a fantastic piece, of software. And I was wondering, we're doing some work with the University of Southampton where we're looking at climate resilience of the estate, especially the school estate and care homes, the elderly. And so we're putting data and humidity loggers, temperature and humidity loggers into a lot of buildings to get readings, and it's quite scary. The kind of results that we're starting to get now, even before you look at climate change into the future. So I think actually mapping, at a granular level, the risk of overheating and climate change and climate adaptation, I think is going to be increasingly important. And I was wondering whether there's a synergy between the kind of the lines of the decarbonisation roadmap and the lines of the climate adaptation roadmap. And I'm presuming you're going to be able to do both with the tool you described.
Yeah, you could run any of those scenarios, doing that. Levels of going through that increase. Well, that's what you'd be doing as you're going through it. If you're going to go into looking at a building in detail, I want to change the windows and improve the insulation and everything like that. You've then got to go in and look at what's the potential for overheating, because you might go, okay, well that's going to reduce my heating bill, but that could also consequently put up my cooling demand within there, or if it's naturally ventilated, and all of a sudden it's massively overheating, you've got overheating problems. How are you going to solve that? So you need to look up that as a holistic thing. You can't just look at these things in isolation, because every decision you make has a consequence somewhere else. It's the ball again from this morning, press one, something else pops out.
Yes.
Now I've got a couple of questions. On the Limerick model, I know working within our council, the big question is, there's all these targets, there's a pathway which is potentially coming forward, but has there been any sort of cost analysis regarding what is the investment needed into the estate? I know there's the savings from the energy saving, which is now improving, but that's from a revenue budget, and we have difficulty with just fund within budgets. So is there, paralleling to this, is there the financial curves and...
we haven't been part of that. That's
you haven't been part of
yeah,
that?
that's been obviously there's QS involved, isn't there?
So there's another side.
There's a whole team involved around this. Is just our involvement in actually doing it.
Now I'm just going to do a quick dig for quality inspectors and clerk of works, as I'm actually one as well. I was just a little bit concerned about your meters not actually being wired into your control panel and being able to get the actual data. Obviously, quick word in for ourselves. But
it was all ticked off on the sheet.
Yeah. Obviously, from Grenville, the golden thread is coming out, and there's going to be lots of changes within construction. I think that people have got their eye on. But one thing, obviously, within schools, we've got IES urban catering and that sort of feedback within quality. But it was interesting also that within building regs, we've got the logbooks that should be prepared, should be on site, should be there on completion, should be explained to the end user, should have all the benchmark information or the design information on it, and it's a building regs requirement.
So a lot of shoulds.
But it's not, for some reason, presumably, it's not a requirement apparently for the building to be signed off by building control. But it's just, we've got these detachments from what is actually required on some of the energy and monitoring, even the simple basic things like a logbook, explaining to the client what metering he's got or she's got, or and it's just that needs tightening up somehow. Because if you can't monitor it, you can't target it, is the old adage, and it's the understanding of the client, the soft landings to do with energy and usage. And once again, you can have, like, we're looking at obviously ISO within schools, but we had a meeting last week, how maybe all the ISO information, if you actually put that in front of an actual school head of FM, whatever, it would half just go totally over their head.
I think there is very much a language thing in this to be able to explain to end users the mechanics of running the buildings that they're taking on, because they're not specialists in that area. And I think it's not just relevant to this. I think it's relevant to every. I sit there with M&E engineers that report to me, and I love them to bits, but I hardly have a clue what they're telling me sometimes. I just need it spelled out for those that for those I've just offended. But I genuinely need them to explain it to me in a language I get.
But if we're not providing the simple information like the logbook on a TM31 or 39 sort of model, CFC model, then we're sort of failing somewhere in that transfer of information from the designers to the end users and the soft landing side of things.
I know what he's saying. There is a simple mechanism, because I've worked for a county council, in that until you get this information, you don't pay for the building.
Yeah, it's never quite as clear cut as that, in all honesty.
There is quite a simple, you pay for what you get, and if you don't get it, you knock it off.
I'm going to come to Paul, and then if anyone else wants, I know then we probably need to wrap up. So if anyone else has a burning question, you can go at the back. So let me do Paul, then Greg, then Jeff.
Yeah, a bit more of a, I guess, a big ticket question for you, Eric, and I guess it's around this word roadmap, I suppose. Is it a roadmap, or is it a pathway of what could be several? Because I think for me there are several pathways, I guess, to get to the same end result. So, whether you go down perhaps a hydrogen route or an electrification route, there are several pathways, and I'll take this point around the economics of this as well, because I think you need to obviously explore all of those pathways and the economics of those to understand ultimately what that optimal solution is. So is your model here presenting that optimal solution, or
no, it's not optimal, because that could change as technology changes over the period of that time. That whole thing is, it has to change. It cannot be right, we're starting here and this is what we're going to do by there, because PV and things like batteries, everything's moving at a fast rate of improvement of efficiency, delivery. So the technologies may come along that you need to want to be included in there. So that can never be fixed. That needs to be continued. The whole thing needs to be. So it's just one timeline of many alternates that can exist and will exist along that time. It needs to be continually updated, played with, tinkered with, and used to inform what's going on.
Great.
Yeah, it's just a question for Eric really, and it's just trying to understand, if you as a local authority, say you've got 400 school buildings, what advice would you give to how you should start on this process? Do you need to do 400 buildings, or would you say you just do typical examples of buildings that would give you quite a lot of information? How would I go back to our members and say, fantastic idea, but we've got 400 schools, and they're going to say to me, how much is that going to cost, and what's the cost benefits?
You just start small on these things. We've done a similar one for a couple now. The first one we did for schools specifically was for Stirling Council. There are 30 schools. We started with 6 from there, but we started with 6 schools that were built between 2003 and 2006. They're all secondary schools, all of them repeat pupils. They should have all been performing. We did this because it was like, well, let's benchmark. There's 6 schools there in the same climate zone, in the same area, in Scotland. They should all designed roughly the same. They should all be performing the same. If I put the information up, you saw what the information we were getting out of how different they were all performing. You had heating systems that were running 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, even when it was heating. You had windows open when it's in because you've got overheating problems. It was just, they were all completely different of the way they'd been commissioned, of the reactive maintenance, of the caretaker reacting that the head teacher would go, oh, my office is a bit cold this morning, so you just come in and switch the heating on, leave it on and never go back to it. Or other kinds of areas where another school where they'd gone in and Christmas Eve switched the heating off and left it off for 2 weeks in the middle of Scotland, and it's minus God knows what's outside. So it's so it just identified very quickly there's massive problems, but it was West on Oxford Street, but it's just that you might for a school, but you want to, you need to start small. You can't possibly do 400 schools. It's the same with doing it. You can't do all of those buildings. You've got to just pick a number, start, show the viability on it, show what you can do, and build from that.
And just because my naivety on it, is that with IES or is that with any consultant that has that?
Yeah, we sell software to people. It's right. Like we don't just do it ourselves. We've done it ourselves to prove that the software works. It can do this stuff. Anybody consultant that's using our software has got access to this. But this is just, the first thing you do is, as I said before, you need to spend this time gathering data, understanding how these buildings are performing, and to be honest, how badly these buildings are performing. Just they're not performing as you think they are.
Just in terms of software that doesn't quite work, Mark Spain seems to think he's on Oxford Street, which worries me just a little bit. But last question for the chap at the back.
Yeah, this is a question for John, if that's okay, please. I think earlier today you mentioned that you didn't apply for official passivist status because it's too expensive. Do you think this discourages clients to proceed with passivist designs, and is there any sort of intention from people up above to reduce this cost to encourage this sort of sustainable design?
That's the only project relating to Passive House that I've worked on that hasn't been certified, my own, only because I was paying for it. But the majority of the, because I'm a one-off individual client, the majority of the large-scale Passive House projects, it's a small cost, but the cost is pretty much the same regardless it's one property or 150 properties. I mean, it's not the same, but proportionally, the more you do, the cost is getting much smaller. So, and it's process cost, and yeah, because there's inspection, there's analysis, there's a review of the information, and that is the cost of certification is only one part of it, because there's a lot of evidence required by the contractor and the designers and the client to provide to the certifiers to show. So it is evidence based. So we would, for example, each type of installation, you're having to show a photograph of that package with the insulation on it and a delivery note. So, I mean, that's to check that they've actually brought rock wool and what's on site is the right type of rock wool against the specification. So that's the level of granular detail you have to provide. And for all of those people to be providing that information is quite a lot of work, and that comes at the cost.
Can I just throw in something? One thing that's important to remember is Passive House is a commercial organisation. They're not non-profit. They're not government run. Nothing like that. They're a company that wants to sell that land, and that comes with very onerous requirements and delivery notes. That's just crazy, and they want to be paid.
Yeah, and yeah, it's a controlled certification, and as people know, with BRIAC, you know, that's an accreditation, and there's a cost associated with the licensing for that. But it is slightly different in Passive House, only because it's very much a community, and there's a lot of open sharing. There's a lot of central resources internationally against different climate databases. A lot of different learning, and the community is very much set up to share. We talked earlier today about capturing knowledge and its commercial value, but the Passive House community is very open, warts and all, so they share the things that don't work as well as the things that do work. So yeah, so there are some positives within that, but there is a cost to do the process, and it comes back down to another aspect, is the commercial recognition. Now that may well have changed, but the Carabrec scheme, which was the Sterling Prize nominated scheme in just outside of Norwich, that was developed with a range of some combinations of public funding, and when that came to open market for sale, the units which were for sale, the local authority valuers put a premium on the Passive House projects of 0, because they said it added no value whatsoever to the open market. So they went on the open market and they were all sold in 2 weeks, because people were getting something that cost more as well as was cheaper to run and was built to a much more certified higher quality standard of construction. But the commercial valuation system recognised no value in that whatsoever.
I think that's a really important point. We know well Carabrec, obviously, because it's a NPS Group project, but one of the key elements of Carabrec is, I think it was a couple of years ago, I don't have the data now, that the energy bills for that development a quarter was £13 a quarter, and not having, talking about the financial assistance that support a low carbon economy, not having the commercial viability mechanism to recognize that is robbing society and robbing all of us really from really important data.
So now energy prices are up here. Hopefully, without going into home improvement, people getting on the bandwagon of home improvement to save energy. So we'll have heat pumps sold by double glazing salesmen as part of packages of bolt-on upgrades at very high prices with very little measuring or application, which is a danger. I think the general public see a building that's more energy efficient now, this year, far higher value than they did last year.
Absolutely.
So I think it's changing.
I think perfect. It's changing. Perfect point to end. I know people. I'd like to say I know people who've got trains, but we know that's not specific. Have trains, but I'm sure people still want to make a break for it. So my thanks to the panel, John, Rainey, and